My name is Rudy Helm, and I was a composer and sound designer in the game industry from the early 90s to the mid 90s, and later went into multimedia using the tools and skills that I had in the sound design and game industry and applied that towards doing tutorials for the government projects. How I got into game audio was I was looking at, I think Joni, my wife, saw an ad in the paper for a composer for games by Broderman in Nevada, California. And so we called and I got an interview, and I met a wonderful gentleman there named Tom Reddick. And although he wasn't able to hire me with someone who didn't have experience in the game industry, he encouraged me to try to learn more about it and stay in because he thought I could do that. And he sort of held my hand for a while in getting to know other folks in the game industry, and it was very useful for years after that. Yes, I have a degree in music. I started out as a kid playing Jimi Hendrix and bands like that and that sort of thing. And then in rock bands, I started getting into progressive rock music. And a lot of my band buddies at the time were saying, Rudy, why are you so technical about the music? Why can't you just lay back and just be simple? And I kept hearing that all the time. And so in order to help not go to fight the Vietnam War, I decided to get a deferment by going to college. Well, Rudy, what are you going to do in college? Okay, I think I'll take music. So I took music. Well, you play guitar, you can't go to school. And our area is around Louisville, Kentucky. The colleges there who taught music at the time did not accept guitar players. So at a community college, I had a piano teacher teach me how to play a little bit of piano. And I learned the first movement of Beethoven's sonata, Moonlight Sonata. And so I learned that, and then I had an audition to get into music school, and I got it. Going back to where to pick up after Tom Reddick in Nevada, well, we kept looking at the papers. We were living in Mill Valley, California at the time. In the San Francisco Chronicle, we saw an ad by Sierra Online for a composer. It wasn't local to where I was living, but at the time I was working as an IT person for San Francisco State's journalism department. Nice gig, but I still had music in my mind and I wanted to do that. And so went up there to the hills of Yosemite to have an interview. And it was a very nice, pleasant interview. Thank you very much. And then left and then wondered what was going to become of that. So I called, probably every week, at least once or twice, for about 3 months. And then finally he said, okay, you're hired. Well, I was told at the time there were about 11 audio people there. And almost all were composers except for 2 that just specialize only in the sound recording for various things. And my boss at the time, the leader of the sound department, said, you're going to sit here with Chris Brayman and be in his office for a while, and you're going to learn the ropes from him. And Chris Brayman did. He taught me how to, well, let me explain this. He had a game coming out called Amon Ra. He was under a tight deadline to finish his music, and he was doing it mainly focusing on the Sound Blaster cards, but he needed to have his music dumbed down, so to speak, for the computers that were only capable of generating one monophonic tone, and also the 3-voice type tones like the Tandy computer of the time. And so he taught me how to do that on his game, and I knew I was doing all right once because I remember the boss came in and he looked at Chris and he says, all right, so how he's doing? And Chris says, he's doing stellar. I thought, yeah, I might be able to handle this stuff. So writing, did you want me to talk about how we did this? Yeah. So the way he explained it to me and the way I enacted his commands was, he said, if you have a chord and you have one voice that you can do in that chord, You want to take the MIDI file that he had, that he would give me, make sure the melody was positioned on the timeline to fire first, and then have the bass be the next pitch that would fire split second next. And ignore all other voices unless they were useful for like arpeggiated sequences. So you have this little scene where there's this melody bopping along and the action's going on in the scene. And if there is an active bass line, so you would make sure that the brain would hear the melody and the brain could also perceive a bass line underneath. And the theory is that your brain would fill in the harmonies just naturally going on with the rest of it. And so that was a very new concept to me, but it sounded like easy instruction, and that's what I did. And when it came to the three, or just the other voices, still on the one voice chip. For instance, the arpeggiated things you were talking about. I may elaborate on that a little bit, saying that sometimes his music didn't really call for arpeggios. Sometimes it did, because that was part of the thing. But he said, put arpeggios in there sometimes, especially if the chord is long, if the melody is long, if the bass is long, then what are you going to do, between all that stuff, rather than just hear one beat go, beep, then another chord, beep, then another chord. So you would take the inner voices and let them take turns firing away so that people could hear something other than just a beep, and then perceive a melody of some kind, or rather perceive a harmonic basis of some kind. And so I did that, and that's what made him tell my boss that I was doing such a stellar job on that process. All right, I'm in. Then there was the Sound Blaster stuff that he was working with. And I really didn't have an opportunity at that experience with him to deal with that, as that's what he was dealing with while he was writing. But I did have to deal with it when I took my own game on, which was The Quest for Glory, Wages of War, the third sequel of that thing. What happened that would, even in that game, stop me for a moment was that they brought in this sound canvas by Roland. Apparently, I was the first musician there to use it. And that was so relaxing to me, that, because I had my synthesizers at home, me being a cool little composer with my digital tools, sample this, sample that, and I'm giving all these constraints to work with these little one voice, three voice chips, and not quite sure what I was going to be dealing with a Sound Blaster, but they brought in a Roland sound canvas, which was closer to the stuff that I was used to doing. And I didn't have to develop my own patches, because as it turns out, the musicians were developing patches for the MD32 and for the Sound Blasters. And so I kind of went right into that before I got to handle that part of it. So I'm happily composing away for my game. And then it's like, well, make sure you do the Sound Blaster part. Okay. So then I learned I have to do patches. So the first thing I do, because I had a short deadline, I felt like it was a big test. You got a game, oh, by the way, it's due in 3 months. And so I felt really pleased that I had a big game, being a new guy in the building. And so I was working hard and diligently on that. And now I'm supposed to write these patches to emulate the sound canvas tones that I chose. And MT32 patches. Now, that wasn't realistic to do in the amount of, as a composer, in the amount of time to get that there. So what someone finally told me to do says, Rudy, here's where you can go on the server and you can look at a bunch of patches that's already been created from all these other games. And some of them have labels and descriptions of what they were from and what games they were from. And so I was doing that. And finally, I think it was Chris who said, oh, you know what? I have a little, because he's a programmer, I have this little program that I wrote that tells me these relationships, and I've used them myself because I made the patches. So basically, I end up borrowing from everybody in terms of their patchwork, but mainly from Chris, having this, the general MIDI relates to this patch that he created for the Sound Blaster. Saved my butt, I'd have to say, in terms of time on that. So then there were the sound effects, and I was kind of new at that. But they were letting 8-bit recordings of sounds happen. So I could sample, I've done sampling, mainly music, but so I went to, sound effects libraries and other things and started using that. Oh, by the way, where are your Sound Blaster sound effects? Back to that again, going back, trying to find out of people's libraries, what kind of sounds would match and emulate what it is that I needed for that game. That was really kind of tricky. Now I'm going to come back to a little bit of the Sound Blaster stuff, but I'll have to say that the reason that the Quest for Glory was not only such a lucky thing for me in many ways. One was getting the game as a new guy. And the other lucky thing is that, oh my gosh, I have to back up and tell you how this happened, because I think this is an interesting dynamic in that period of computer game business. As I said before, my boss was my sound man. He was the sound guy. He took care of everybody's sound. We would have meetings. He would say, Chris, you do that. Rudy, you do that. Sometimes we were all working on 5 games at the same time, which is why I did a lot of conversions like I did for Chris. At the same time, working for other people's games, getting their conversions into those 1-voice, 3-voice little machines. But Ken Williams, I guess, decided we need to restructure. And what he did was he brought in this really nice fellow from Hewlett-Packard, he worked for them, to come in and instead tell us what to do. First thing he did was fire my sound boss. Kept me on as a musician, but no longer as the sound boss. He fired the graphics sound boss. Kept him on as an artist, but no longer the boss. In other words, we all weren't just working on all the projects together with these little managements of disciplines. Instead, he created a bunch of little companies. Quest for Glory was its own company. King's Quest was its own company. All these other things were actually companies, and each one had their own tester in it that would test the game as we made it. Each one did have at least one main programmer and 1 or 2 other programmers, had one composer in it. And so there we were, all isolated from all other projects. Now, we had a producer, and she was kind of new at the producing game. Tammy Dargan, wonderful, I'll love her the rest of my life. She told Corey and Laurie Coe, who are the game designers of the Quest for Glory Center, I didn't know this till later, but what she had apparently done was she told him, leave him alone. Everything you have, you come to me. Tammy wanted to filter everything to us, not have the creators of the game control, because that's how it used to be. So apparently, and not being new, I didn't know, the calls would go to the musician and feedback. So I never really heard from him. What I also learned later was, I still know Lori because she's still in Oakhurst. Occasionally I run into her with, get her something, and we're friendly, right? So what happened is that they were frustrated. They didn't apparently appreciate Tammy's control like that. I'm not aware of that, but I'm enjoying it because here I am, a composer with nobody telling me what to do. I asked Tammy, what do you want me to do? Tammy says, you're the composer. Isn't that a dream? It's also kind of nerve-wracking, but it was great. So everything that I did for Quest for Glory was because I thought, well, this is a good idea. Let's try this. Now, because of the time constraint, I did steal from myself. I had themes that I had already written and some that I thought would work pretty well in certain rooms in the game. So I would go ahead and redeploy those, maybe add some pitch bends here and there to make it sound more Eastern-ish, or of course we were in this Africana or, Middle East of places. And I had written a couple of symphonies. I didn't tell you that, but I'd written a couple of symphonies that the Southern Indiana Orchestra, a small group, played back after I finished college. And I had midified those as a personal exercise after that was all done. So I had conveniently had these themes and orchestrations done that I could just put and load into this game in certain places, which I think really worked out pretty well. I think it did. So then I had to go, and do the Sound Blaster things and try to put sound effects and find them and scrounge around. One of the composers said, you know what? He's not doing the Sound Blaster stuff right. He tells that to Tammy, my producer. He says, let me do the conversions. And in a way, I was kind of glad about that because I really didn't have the time to do it anyway. I didn't think it was a matter of that he's not doing it right. I might have gotten around to it and done it better, but I did it exactly the way Chris told me how. He was happy with my work. Why aren't anybody else happy with what I'm doing to my own music? So he basically rewrites. He's putting himself into a lot of these one voice, three voice things. And to be honest with you, I've never heard it. I've never heard my game played on a one voice computer or a three voice Tandy. So I'm sure he did an excellent job. That's why he gets credit for additional music on the game. People ask me this a lot, by the way, so I have to tell this story a bunch. So to catch me up, I got the game in and the Tandy, blah, blah, blah. We released finally 1993 of, I think, February maybe. Then we had a big layoff at Sierra Online. They laid off 1 out of every 4 people. And I was one of them. And I think one of the reasons I was one of them chosen to go was probably because I wasn't so, I came out of a university doing IT for a company protected by a union. I'd never worked in a private industry before and not knowing how proper politics should work. When the gentleman from HP came in and told Mark he couldn't be my boss anymore, he still secretly had these meetings with the audio people. You do this, you do that, you do this. And I panicked and I was thinking, I can't do all of that. I've got this game I got to put out in three months. I said, no. And I felt like at the time I was in my right because our new boss said, why am I saying yes to this guy who's not my boss anymore? But I kind of think that it hurt his feelings. And if I had to live it all over again, I might have tried to approach it differently than I did. So I think I was recommended to be one of the cuts on the 1 out of every 4 because maybe my politics isn't as gentle as it should have been. So I almost take a job in Utah, almost take a job down in Carlsbad. In fact, I say yes to both of them, I think. But then Accolade, who I'd interviewed with, who didn't say yes, finally calls me up and says yes at the last minute, and then the next Monday I'm going to move to Utah. So I'll call Utah and say, sorry, I'm really sorry to do this to you. but I get a chance to, and that was the great job where they let me stay at home 4 days a week and only go down in San Jose once to have meetings with them. And even at that, they called me the sound manager. So they had a little recording studio in there that I would go and visit once a day. And eventually they gave me an assistant, Rick Kelly, wonderful assistant to have. And so we did a bunch of console games and a little bit of PC games. There's only in the 5 years I was there, I only actually wrote, I think, 2 games? 3 games. One of them didn't get released. The first one that I got was Speed Racer. Now, the theme song was actually the cartoon. I don't know if you've ever seen the Speed Racer cartoon, but there was a theme song that someone wrote. They had the license to that. And so they basically wanted me to take that theme song and for every race, rewrite the music and the energy and the style based on the environment that we were in. If it was in the West, do a country environment. If we're over here, do a techno environment. If we're over here. But whenever there's a melody, I would sneak in that original melody that was in.
Here I go.
So that one I got to do. And there was a game called Cybernauts that we did, which was a fighting game. And that was techno-based. And I had a new boss there. And he basically taught me how to do techno because he knew that I didn't have that experience. And the way he did that was, at the time, he went and bought me a bunch of Moby tapes. About 15 of them, I think. Here, take them home. I did. I immersed myself in Moby tapes and wrote a really kick-ass techno soundtrack for that Cybernauts game, which in the end, they decided not to release the game. And it was their first fighting 3D type thing, other than 2D stuff. And so I did a lot of sound effects for almost all of the other games, some composers. The idea was, more than being just a composer there, I was supposed to help the various producers of various games match up with other composers from outside of the building, that is freelance. And got lots of freelance submissions all the time, so I was supposed to go through those, try to weed them out, and then maybe match some of those up with some of the producers for their projects that were there. And let's see, there's another game that I can't think of the name of. I worked on that one.
Bubsy?
No, I mean, what I did with Bubsy was conversions, and the composers that were hired for those games didn't know anything about all these constraints that we've been talking about for sound blasters and all these other sound cards. And so I would take their music and adapt it to a way that the programmers could then use it in the game. So I would kind of rewrite it sometimes, depending, because the original composer really wasn't aware of some of that stuff. But that's what I did for a lot of them. Part of my job was not to have the outside composers have to worry about that. And when I matched them up with other producers, then I would be able to make that music fit into, I hand it to a producer, here it is, the composer did it, do you like it? So that was kind of tricky, getting that middle ground in between a composer and a producer to like something and finally come up with it. The interesting thing about that time in the 90s, with knowing a lot of people, a lot of the game industry audio type from the IASIG, there were people that were really enthusiastic about what we now call adaptive audio, but there were actually a lot of people who resisted it. And some of them thought that we should just make MIDI trigger only the audio, a sound recording of a performance, and that would make the MIDI much simpler. There's one note for a trigger of a loop, and then you could trigger different loops with a MIDI note that wouldn't actually make sense on a MIDI card. It would have to be playing digital audio sounds. So we had that argument to deal with in the IASIG, and it occurred to us, well, maybe you can't just make one thing, one science work for everybody. You have to maybe have a menu of possibilities. And then the game developers could choose among those possibilities, and still we're offering them the guidelines, the recommended practices to do those kinds of treatments. And that seemed like it went on for years, trying to get all that across. At the meetings, at the game conferences, I generally was a master of ceremonies. I would introduce the real smart people in the room and get them to say things. Whenever I did an audio presentation, that it was usually me and Rob Hubbard moderating, a bunch of other geniuses, right? But somebody had to do the moderation, so it may as well be us, you know. So we did that. And I stay active kind of in the IASIG as a member, even to this day. I think a lot of good things have happened in it.
Was there competition between you guys at all?
Wasn't it called Muse or something? iMuse. Yeah, Michael Land?
Yep.
Yeah. I'm glad you were, it's been a long time since I've thought of Mike. Yeah, so at the game conference I met him. And he actually wanted us in the IASIG, he really wanted to use that as kind of a foundation. And I could see why. I mean, they already went to all the trouble of working on something like that. And they wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel if a bunch of us nuts at the IASIG decided, no, we got to do it like this. And that was some of the friction, I think, sometimes too, because a lot of people had good ideas and they had different ways of coming at almost the same approach, you know? And I never wrote for any of his games, so I don't know really how that science worked or what you were supposed to do. But, you know, they had good success with their stuff, so I don't see why it couldn't have been as good an approach as any